Welcome to the channel of stories about betrayal and love. I always told myself I wasn't the jealous type. Sure, I'd catch myself noticing little things about Claire, new clothes, the way she smiled at her phone more often than usual, but I'd brush it off. She was beautiful, charming, and successful, and I figured my insecurities were my problem, not hers. That's what I told myself, anyway. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened. I wasn't supposed to be on that side of town. I had a meeting cancel last minute, so I decided to take the long way back to the office. Traffic was slow, the kind that forces you to crawl forward a few feet every couple of minutes. I was mindlessly scanning the cars around me when I saw her. Claire. She was in the passenger seat of a sleek black BMW, laughing at something the driver said. The man was sharply dressed, the kind of guy who looks like he stepped out of a magazine ad, broad shoulders, a perfect jawline, and confidence radiating off him. At first, I thought I must be mistaken. Maybe it was someone else with her same wavy brown hair, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. But then she turned, and there was no mistaking it. Her profile, the little wrinkle by her eye when she smiled, it was her. My heart started pounding. Why was she in someone else's car? And why did it look so intimate? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a work thing. Claire worked in corporate PR, and her job often put her in fancy circles. But deep down, I knew. The way she leaned toward him, the way he glanced at her when she laughed, it wasn't the kind of body language you'd use with a colleague. Before I knew it, I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to follow them, but traffic wouldn't budge. By the time I managed to switch lanes, the BMW was long gone. I spent the rest of the drive in a fog, replaying the scene over and over. When I got home that evening, Claire greeted me like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day, her smile warm and familiar. I wanted to ask her about it right then and there, but the words wouldn't come out. What if I was wrong? What if I accused her of something and made a fool of myself? Instead, I muttered something about a stressful day and went straight to the shower. The water ran over my face, but I couldn't shake the image of her in that car, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. For days after seeing Claire in that car, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe she'd had a ride-share mix-up. But deep down, I knew. Claire started coming home later than usual, often claiming she had client dinners or team-building events. She'd breeze through the door, toss her coat onto the couch, and pour herself a glass of wine, all while acting like nothing had changed. Another late night? I asked casually one evening. Yeah, sorry. It's been crazy at work, she replied, avoiding my eyes as she slipped off her heels. It sounded believable, but something about the way she said it felt practiced. She'd always been ambitious, she had to be in her line of work, but lately, her dedication to the job seemed almost obsessive. Her wardrobe shifted, too. Where she used to wear simple, professional outfits, she'd started buying more daring pieces. When I asked about it, she brushed it off. I just thought I'd treat myself, she'd said with a laugh. Claire was laughing more in general, but not with me. One evening, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She smiled, a small, private smile, and for the first time, I felt like I didn't know her at all. Something funny? I asked, trying to sound light-hearted. Oh, just a silly meme, she replied, quickly locking her screen. That small action hit me like a punch to the gut. She never used to hide her phone from me. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. My heart immediately began to race. I crept downstairs, careful not to make a sound, and found her sitting in the living room, her phone glowing in the dark. Claire. I said, my voice startling her. She jumped, quickly setting the phone down. Jesus, Michael, you scared me. What are you doing? Just couldn't sleep, she said, smiling nervously. I didn't want to wake you. Everything okay? Of course, she said quickly. Too quickly. Go back to bed. I lingered for a moment, staring at her, before heading upstairs. I lay awake for hours, replaying the scene in my mind. The way she jumped when I called her name, the way she smiled nervously, it wasn't normal. The next day, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was stressed from work. Maybe I was projecting my insecurities onto her. But when I saw her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter, I couldn't stop myself. The screen lit up, revealing a notification, "Can't wait to see you again. Yesterday was amazing." I froze. My hand hovered over her phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. Should I look? Should I ask her about it? I didn't do either. Instead, I walked away, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. By the time Claire came downstairs, smiling and chatting about her plans for the day, I could barely meet her eyes. Are you okay? She asked, tilting her head. Yeah, just tired, I said. But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. The text message on Claire's phone haunted me. Can't wait to see you again. Yesterday was amazing. Who was it from? What had they done that was so amazing? I didn't know what hurt more, her betrayal or the fact that she could look me in the eye every day and act like nothing was wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I started noticing little things. Claire had always been particular about her appearance, but now it felt different. She had a new energy, a glow. She'd started wearing perfume again, the kind she used to wear when we first started dating. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd smelled it on her. Then there were the late nights. The excuses. The casual lies that didn't add up. One evening, she came home with takeout, her face lit up like she'd just come from a party. You're in a good mood, I said, studying her. Oh, just relieved to have the week behind me, she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. What had she really been doing? Who had she been with? A few days later, I decided to push her. So, how's the new client project going? I asked over dinner. She froze for just a moment before recovering. Good. Busy, but good. What's the client's name again? Evan, she said, picking at her food. He's kind of demanding, but it's nothing I can't handle. Evan. I made a mental note of the name. Is he local? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, he's based here in the city, she said, glancing at me briefly before changing the subject. That night, as she showered, I sat on the edge of our bed, scrolling through my phone. I opened her social media profile, not something I'd ever done before, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Her posts were as polished as ever, pictures from work events, dinners with friends, nothing out of the ordinary. But in the comments section of one photo, I spotted it, looking amazing as always. Can't wait for our next meeting. Evan. I clicked on his profile, my heart racing. His photos screamed wealth and confidence, luxury cars, exotic vacations, tailored suits. He was the kind of guy who thrived in Claire's world. I felt sick. Was this him? Was this the man I'd seen in the car with her? When Claire came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel and humming to herself, I forced a smile. You okay? She asked, rubbing her hair dry. Yeah, I said, slipping my phone into my pocket. Just tired. I spent the next few days trying to keep my emotions in check, but it was getting harder. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the life we'd built together, a life that now felt like a lie. One evening, I found myself standing in our walk-in closet, staring at her clothes. My eyes landed on a dress I didn't recognize, a sleek, black number with a plunging neckline. I picked it up, feeling the silky fabric between my fingers. "Michael?" Claire's voice startled me. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just looking for something," I said, quickly hanging the dress back up. She frowned but didn't press further. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still didn't have the full picture. Who was Evan to her? How long had this been going on? And what was I going to do about it? The cracks in our marriage weren't sudden. They'd been there for a while, small and subtle, like hairline fractures in a foundation. But lately, those cracks had started to spread, and now they felt impossible to ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about Evan. Every time Claire mentioned work, my mind would go straight to him. Was she meeting him today? Did they laugh together the way we used to? I hated myself for obsessing, but I couldn't help it. One night, as we sat in the living room, I decided to bring it up. "Do you ever feel like we've been distant lately?" I asked, my voice careful. Claire glanced up from her laptop, startled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's just, things feel different." She frowned, setting her laptop aside. "Michael, if something's bothering you, just say it." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to lay it all out, to tell her I'd seen her in that car, that I'd read the text message, that I knew about Evan. But another part of me was terrified of what she might say. "It's nothing," I said finally. "Just work stress, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. The next morning, as I watched her get ready for work, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping further away from me. She wore a fitted blazer and a pencil skirt, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. "You look nice," I said, my voice hollow. "Thanks," she said, barely glancing at me. As the door closed behind her, I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't ignore. When had we stopped talking to each other? When had we become two people just going through the motions? That evening, I tried to reconnect. I picked up her favorite wine on the way home and ordered takeout from the Thai place she loved. When she walked in the door, her expression softened. "What's all this?" "Just thought we could have a nice night in," I said, forcing a smile. She hesitated, then smiled back. "That's sweet. Let me just change, and I'll be right down." For a while, things felt almost normal. We laughed over dinner, reminisced about old trips we'd taken, and even talked about the future, vacations, renovations, dreams we hadn't discussed in years. But as the night went on, I noticed her phone buzzing on the counter. She glanced at it quickly, then flipped it over so the screen faced down. My stomach tightened. "Who's texting you this late?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just work stuff," she said, too quickly. I nodded, but the mood was already broken. After dinner, she excused herself, saying she had some emails to catch up on. I sat alone in the living room, staring at her empty wine glass. This was what our marriage had become, moments of normalcy interrupted by 1,000 unanswered questions. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't stop thinking about how far apart we'd grown. We used to talk for hours, sharing everything, our dreams, our fears, our stupid little inside jokes. Now, it felt like there was a wall between us, one I didn't know how to break down. And the worst part? I wasn't sure she even wanted me to try. By the end of that week, I couldn't take it anymore. Every moment with Claire felt like walking on eggshells, every smile she gave me felt like a lie. The constant buzzing of her phone, the quick glances at her screen, the way she'd leave the room to answer certain calls, it was driving me insane. I needed answers. On Saturday morning, Claire told me she was meeting a friend for brunch. She kissed me on the cheek and headed out, her new perfume trailing behind her. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway, then grabbed my jacket. I didn't even know where I was going at first. I just knew I had to follow her. I kept a safe distance as I trailed her through the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. She turned onto a quiet street lined with trendy cafes and parked her car in front of a bistro. I watched as she stepped out, dressed impeccably as always. But she wasn't alone. Evan was there, waiting for her on the sidewalk. He looked every bit as polished as his photos, tall, confident, and annoyingly good-looking. When he saw Claire, his face lit up, and he pulled her into a hug that lasted just a second too long. I stayed in my car, watching as they walked into the bistro together. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't catch my breath. For a moment, I considered confronting them right then and there. Storming into the restaurant, demanding an explanation, making a scene. But instead, I sat there, frozen, staring at the entrance like it held all the answers I was too afraid to hear. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, they came back out, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Evan opened the car door for her, a sleek black BMW, and she slid in without hesitation. I followed them again, my heart pounding as I stayed several cars behind. They drove across town to a boutique hotel, pulling into the parking lot like they'd done this 100 times before. I parked on the street, far enough away to avoid being noticed, and watched as they disappeared through the hotel doors. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. The evidence was right in front of me, undeniable and impossible to ignore. But now that I had it, I didn't know what to do. When I finally drove home, I felt like a ghost moving through the motions of my life. Claire came home later that evening, cheerful and carefree, as if nothing had happened. "How was brunch?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It was nice," she said, smiling. "It's been so long since I caught up with Marissa." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I realized something. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. The next morning, I woke up with a weight on my chest that felt like it would crush me. Every time I looked at Claire, the image of her and Evan flashed in my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of her lies. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I had to confront her. It was Sunday afternoon when I finally worked up the nerve. Claire was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through her laptop, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "Claire," I said, my voice tight. She looked up, surprised. "Yeah." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Then I took a deep breath and let them out. "Who's Evan?" Her face froze. For a moment, she didn't say anything, but her eyes gave her away, widening just slightly, flickering with something that looked like panic. "Evan," she repeated, her voice carefully measured. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "I've seen you with him. I saw you get in his car. I followed you to the hotel." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like she was searching for the right words, but none came. "Michael, it's not what you think," she finally said. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you've been cheating on me." Her face crumpled, and for a second, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she looked down at her hands and said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." The air left my lungs in a rush. I stumbled back a step, staring at her like I didn't even recognize her anymore. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's not serious," she said quickly. It's been a few months." "A few months?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Claire, do you even hear yourself? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and you think it's not serious?" She stood up, her face flushed. "You don't understand, Michael. You're never here. You're always at work, always distracted. I've felt invisible for years, and he noticed me. Her words hit me like a slap. You think this is my fault? I asked, my voice low. I'm not saying that, she said, tears streaming down her face. But you've been so distant, Michael. It's like you don't even see me anymore. I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. So what, you thought sleeping with someone else was the solution? Instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you just decided to throw it all away. She didn't say anything, and the silence was deafening. I shook my head, backing toward the door. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice breaking. Michael, wait, she started, but I was already walking out the door. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly around the city, trying to process everything Claire had said. Her words kept replaying in my mind, I've felt invisible for years. He noticed me. It was like a knife to the chest. I wanted to be angry, at her, at Evan, at the entire situation, but beneath the anger was something worse. Doubt. Was she right? Had I been so wrapped up in my own world that I hadn't seen her slipping away? I parked outside a 24-hour diner and sat there for hours, staring at my reflection in the windshield. At some point, I realized I couldn't let it end like this. I needed answers, not just from Claire, but from him. By the next morning, I had a plan. It didn't take long to find Evan. He wasn't exactly discreet, his social media was practically a highlight reel of his life. Fancy cars, exclusive events, expensive dinners. He even had a post with Claire in the background, though she was cleverly cropped out of the caption, another successful client dinner. I found out where he worked, a sleek high-rise downtown, and waited in my car until I saw him leave for lunch. When he walked out of the building, I almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't just confident, he was magnetic. The kind of guy who commanded attention without even trying. I followed him to a nearby cafe, watching as he ordered a coffee and sat by the window, scrolling through his phone. My hands were shaking as I walked in. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, if I was going to yell, punch him, or just fall apart. But when I stood in front of his table, he looked up at me and smiled. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but detached. "Yeah," I said, my voice colder than I expected. "I'm Claire's husband." His smile faltered for a split second before he recovered, leaning back in his chair. "Ah," he said, setting his coffee down. "I was wondering when you'd show up." The arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not," he said with a shrug. "These things have a way of coming to light eventually." "These things?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're talking about my wife, the woman I've spent years building a life with. And you're acting like this is just some game to you." He sighed, rubbing his temple like I was a minor inconvenience. "Look, Michael, is it? I'm not the bad guy here. Claire came to me. I didn't force her into anything." "She's married," I snapped. "That's supposed to mean something." He leaned forward, his expression calm but condescending. "Maybe it does. But ask yourself this, if she was happy, would she have come to me in the first place?" His words hit me like a slap. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't know anymore. "I don't know what she's told you," he continued, "but Claire deserves to feel valued. And if you couldn't give her that, well," he shrugged, letting the sentence hang in the air. I clenched my fists, every fiber of my being screaming at me to hit him. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at him, realizing for the first time that I wasn't just angry at him, I was angry at myself. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving him to his smug, self-satisfied grin. I drove home from the cafe in a daze, Evan's words replaying in my mind. If she was happy, would she have come to me in the first place? I hated him for saying it, but part of me hated myself even more for wondering if he was right. Had I failed Claire? Had I driven her into his arms without even realizing it? When I got home, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes cautious. "Michael," she said quietly. "We need to talk." I dropped my keys on the counter and sat down across from her. "Yeah," I said. "We do." She closed her laptop and folded her hands in front of her, like she was bracing herself for what was coming. "I know you're angry," she began. "And you have every right to be. What I did was wrong. I hurt you, and I betrayed your trust." I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. "But there's something you don't know," she continued, her voice trembling. "Something I haven't told you." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. He wasn't just some guy I met. He was a client. A big one. And I didn't have a choice. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked away, wiping at her eyes. "He made it clear that if I didn't play along, he'd pull his account. And if that happened, I could have lost my job." For a moment, I just stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. "So, what? You're saying he blackmailed you?" She shook her head quickly. "No. Not outright. But he used his position to pressure me, and I felt like I didn't have a way out." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore everything I'd seen. The way she smiled at him, the way she laughed. "You didn't seem like someone who felt trapped," I said bitterly. She flinched, her face crumpling. "I know how it looked, Michael. And I'm not trying to make excuses. I should have told you. I should have trusted you enough to let you help me. But I was scared. And ashamed." I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. This wasn't what I'd expected. I thought I'd be angry, that I'd yell and scream and tell her I never wanted to see her again. But instead, all I felt was exhaustion. "I don't know what to believe anymore," I said finally. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on mine. "I'm telling you the truth, Michael. I made a mistake, an awful, unforgivable mistake. But I love you, and I want to fix this. If you'll let me." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The weight of her words, of everything that had happened, hung between us like a wall I wasn't sure we could ever climb. That night, Claire asked if we could talk. Really talk. She wanted me to hear her side of the story, everything she'd been holding back for months. We sat across from each other in the living room, the air between us heavy and suffocating. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand how we got here." I crossed my arms, my jaw tight. "I'm listening." She hesitated, running a hand through her hair. "It started small. Harmless, I thought. Evan came on as a client, and we hit it off professionally. He was charming, confident, and he noticed things about me that no one else seemed to notice anymore." I flinched at her words, but she kept going. "At first, it felt good. Just to be seen. You know. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't trying to hurt you. But he has a way of getting into your head, of making you feel like you're the most important person in the world." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "And you believed him?" "I was lonely, Michael," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was drowning, and I didn't even realize it. You were always working, always distracted. And I didn't know how to tell you how much it was killing me." I opened my mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "I'm not blaming you," she said quickly. "This is on me. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have fought harder for us. But instead, I let myself get swept up in something that was never real." Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes. I didn't love him, Michael. I need you to know that. It wasn't about him. It was about me. About how empty I felt and how desperate I was to feel something again. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to be angry, to yell and scream and tell her that none of this was an excuse. But the truth was, part of me understood. For years, I'd thrown myself into my work, thinking I was doing it for us, for our future. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped paying attention to the present. To her. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally, my voice raw. She shook her head, her tears spilling over. I tried. I hinted. But every time, it felt like you weren't really listening. And eventually, I stopped trying. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her words sinking in. I wasn't sure how to feel, angry, hurt, guilty. Maybe all of it at once. I don't know if we can fix this, I said quietly. Claire looked at me, her eyes desperate. I don't know either. But I want to try. I love you, Michael. I always have. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words felt too big, too heavy. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, wondering if we'd ever be able to find our way back to each other. After Claire's confession, the silence between us was deafening. For the first time in years, I felt like I was looking at her, really looking at her, and seeing a stranger. But the truth was, I wasn't entirely innocent either. For weeks, I'd been consumed by her betrayal, by the lies and the deceit. But sitting there in that quiet, suffocating living room, a memory clawed its way to the surface. Claire, I said, my voice low. She looked up at me, her eyes still red from crying. What is it? I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. There's something I need to tell you. Her brow furrowed, and I saw a flicker of fear cross her face. Okay. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. A few months ago, before all of this. There was someone at work. Claire's expression froze. What do you mean? She was a colleague, I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I lost my nerve. It wasn't an affair. I swear to you, it never went that far. But there were moments. Moments where it could have. Her face twisted in confusion and hurt. Moments? She was new, and we worked closely on a big project, I explained. She was smart, funny, and she reminded me of a younger version of you. And for a little while, I liked the attention. Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I never acted on it, I continued, desperate to make her understand. I thought about it, sure, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't cross that line. But I still feel guilty for even letting it get that far. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Claire stared at me, her eyes searching mine for something, maybe the truth, maybe forgiveness. So, what? She said finally, her voice trembling. You thought about cheating, but you didn't, and that makes you better than me? That's not what I'm saying, I said quickly. I'm just trying to be honest with you. If we're going to move forward, you need to know everything. Her laugh was bitter and sharp. Well, congratulations, Michael. You win the moral high ground. That's not fair, I snapped. I'm trying here, Claire. I'm trying to meet you halfway. Halfway? She shot back. Do you have any idea how hard this is for me? To sit here and pour my heart out to you, knowing that you'll probably never look at me the same way again. I felt the weight of her words settle over me, heavy and suffocating. She was right. I didn't know how hard this was for her. But I knew how hard it was for me. I'm not trying to hurt you, I said quietly. I'm just trying to be honest. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Honest, she repeated bitterly. If we'd been honest with each other from the start, maybe we wouldn't be here right now. I didn't have a response to that. Because she was right. The days that followed were a blur of anger, confusion, and silence. Neither of us knew what to say anymore. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope over an endless chasm. I could feel Claire pulling away from me, emotionally and physically. She spent more time in the office or locked in the guest room with her laptop. At night, she'd lie stiff and silent beside me, as if the space between us wasn't just inches but miles. One evening, I came home to find her packing a suitcase. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She didn't look up. "I think we need some space." Space? The word felt like a punch to the gut. "So, that's it? You're just going to leave?" She zipped the suitcase shut and finally met my eyes. "I don't know what else to do, Michael. Every time I look at you, I see the hurt I caused. And every time you look at me, I can feel how much you hate me for it." "I don't hate you," I said quickly. "Maybe not," she replied softly. "But you don't love me the way you used to, either." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew she was right. She hesitated at the door, her suitcase in hand. "I'm not giving up," she said. I need time to figure out who I am without all of this. And maybe you do, too." And just like that, she was gone. The silence in the house was deafening without her. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, haunted by the memories of our life together. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture, every little thing we'd chosen together felt like a cruel reminder of what we'd lost. I wanted to call her, to tell her to come home, but my pride wouldn't let me. Instead, I buried myself in work, hoping it would drown out the pain. But the pain didn't go away. It followed me everywhere, a constant ache in my chest. One night, after too many drinks and too much time scrolling through old photos, I made a decision. I grabbed my keys and drove across town to Evan's place. It wasn't hard to find. The smug bastard had his address listed on his company's website. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not scared. "Michael," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What a surprise." "This ends now," I said, my voice shaking with barely restrained rage. He smirked. "And what, exactly, are you going to do about it?" "I mean it," I said, stepping closer. "You stay away from her. From us. Or I swear to God, I'll—" "You'll what?" he interrupted, his tone mocking. "Ruin my reputation. Tell the world your wife was so unhappy with you that she came to me. Be my guest." The smugness in his voice pushed me over the edge. Before I knew it, my fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling back into his pristine living room. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, my knuckles throbbing. Evan wiped his mouth, smirking even as blood trickled from the corner of his lip. "Feel better?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. When I got home that night, my hand was still throbbing, and my mind was racing. I sat on the couch in the dark, the adrenaline from my confrontation with Evan slowly wearing off. But the anger didn't leave. If anything, it burned hotter. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at Claire. At myself. At everything. A week passed, and the silence in the house was unbearable. I thought space would give us clarity, but all it did was make me feel more lost. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was her. But the screen stayed empty of her name. Then, late one evening, my phone finally rang. It was Claire. "Michael," she said softly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "Where are you?" "Home," she said. I came back." I hung up without another word and drove home as fast as I could. When I walked through the door, she was sitting on the couch, her suitcase still by the door. "I didn't think you'd come back," I said, my voice quiet. "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "But I couldn't stay away. This is my home, too." The tension in the room was thick, but there was something else, too, something fragile and hopeful. "I've been thinking," she began, wringing her hands. "About us. About everything." And I realized something. I sat down across from her, waiting. "I've been blaming you for so much," she said, her voice trembling. "For not being there. For making me feel invisible. But the truth is, I didn't fight for us, either. I let the distance grow. I let the cracks widen. And I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry." Her words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "I'm sorry, too," I said finally. "For everything. For not seeing you. For not being there when you needed me." My voice broke, and I took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to fix this, Claire. I don't even know if we can." She looked at me, her eyes full of tears. "I don't know, either. But I want to try. I want to be better. For us." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. We sat there in the quiet, not saying anything more. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same side. But even as the silence stretched between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. The next few days were like walking on thin ice. Claire and I avoided the heavier conversations, sticking to neutral topics: work, groceries, small talk. But the unspoken tension was always there, lingering just below the surface. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "What's all this?" I asked, gesturing to the mess. "I've been going through everything," she said quietly. "Our finances, our plans, everything we built together. And I realized something: we've been living parallel lives for years. Sharing a house, but not a life." Her words stung because they were true. "I don't want that anymore, Michael," she continued. "I want us to find our way back to each other. But I can't do it alone." I sat down across from her, the weight of her words settling over me. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted. "We start small," she said, her voice firm. "We start by being honest. About everything." I hesitated, the memory of my confrontation with Evan flashing in my mind. I hadn't told her about it, hadn't mentioned the punch or the smug grin on his face. Part of me wanted to keep it buried, but the other part knew she deserved the truth. "There's something I need to tell you," I said finally. She looked at me, her eyes cautious. "Okay." "I went to see Evan," I said, my voice low. "I confronted him." Her face froze, her lips parting slightly. "What?" "I couldn't let it go," I admitted. "I had to face him, to make him understand that this wasn't okay." "What did you say to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "More than I should have," I said honestly. "It got heated. I punched him." Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Michael, why would you?" "Because I was angry," I interrupted. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of him walking away from this without consequences." She stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and sadness. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Maybe not," I said. "But I couldn't just do nothing." The room fell silent, the weight of my actions hanging between us. "I don't want this to be about him," she said finally. "I don't want him to have any more power over us, over our lives." Her words struck a chord, and I realized she was right. This wasn't about Evan anymore. It was about us, about whether we could rebuild what we'd broken. "Then let's make it about us," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Her fingers trembled as they curled around mine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days following that conversation were tentative but hopeful. For the first time in years, Claire and I were talking, not just about work or bills, but about us. About the things we'd avoided for so long. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, balancing honesty with the fear of reopening old wounds. But slowly, the walls we'd built between us began to crack. One evening, we decided to cook dinner together, something we hadn't done in years. As we chopped vegetables side by side, Claire glanced at me and smiled, a small, genuine smile that reminded me of the woman I fell in love with. "Remember the first time we cooked together?" she asked. I chuckled, shaking my head. How could I forget? I burned the garlic, and you almost set the kitchen on fire trying to save it. She laughed, the sound light and familiar. We were such a mess back then. Still are, I said, nudging her playfully. Her smile softened, and for a moment, the weight of everything we'd been through seemed to lift. The next weekend, Claire suggested we go for a walk in the park. It was something we used to do all the time before life got in the way. As we strolled through the tree-lined paths, she reached for my hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For giving us another chance," she replied. "I know it's not easy. And I know I don't deserve it. But I'm grateful." I squeezed her hand, my throat tightening. "We both made mistakes," I said. "But if we're going to make this work, we have to let go of the past. All of it." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I want that. More than anything." That night, as we sat on the couch together, Claire pulled out an old photo album. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on a beach, our faces sunburned but smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. "We look so young," I said, smiling. "We were," she replied. "And so in love." I looked at her, the weight of her words settling over me. "I want to get back to that," I said. "Me too," she whispered. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page, moving towards something better. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when the past threatened to pull us back. But in that moment, I believed we could make it. Months passed, and life slowly found its rhythm again. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real. Every day felt like a small step forward, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Claire and I started therapy together, something neither of us had ever considered before. It wasn't easy to sit in a room and lay everything bare, to confront the parts of ourselves we'd ignored for so long. But it helped. It gave us the tools to communicate, to listen, to understand each other in ways we hadn't before. One evening, after a particularly heavy session, Claire and I sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked, her voice soft. "Every day," I admitted. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you regret staying?" I shook my head. "No. Do you?" She smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. "No. But I regret letting it get this far." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We can't change the past, Claire. But we can learn from it. And we can choose to move forward." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to move forward. With you." Months turned into a year, and while the scars of what happened remained, they no longer felt like open wounds. They were reminders of where we'd been, of what we'd fought through to get to where we were. One day, as we packed up the house to move into a smaller place, one we chose together, I found an old notebook of Claire's. Inside were scribbled lists and notes, plans for vacations we'd never taken, recipes she wanted to try, and little reminders to herself: "Call Michael, tell him you love him." "Look at this," I said, handing her the notebook. She flipped through it, her smile growing as she recognized her old handwriting. "I forgot about this," she said, laughing softly. I pointed to the note about calling me. "You always did love leaving me little reminders." Claire looked up at me, her eyes warm. "I don't need reminders anymore," she said. "Not about that." As we settled into our new home, I realized something: forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a choice you make every day. To let go of the anger, the hurt, the resentment. To focus on the good, no matter how small. And love? Love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Claire and I weren't perfect, but we were trying. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Subscribe to our channel and don't miss the next story. It's even more shocking than this one.